So this is a talk about the impact that a small group of Scots had on the nation of India. This is, as I take it, the subset of a much larger story. Of course, everything in the world is a subset of a larger story, but this is a particularly interesting one. The Scots were, in effect, the last European nation to be civilized. If by civilization we're referring to the cultural impact of the Christian faith working its way out into all of that nation's institutions. They brought up the tail end. At the same time, as can be seen in Arthur Herman's very fine book, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, something really remarkable happened just a short time after that, a short time speaking with sort of a zoom out, more historical perspective. It is amazing how rapidly amazing things started to happen in Scotland. And this particular story about missions is a subset of that larger foment, that larger churn that was going on in Scotland. So this story is one aspect of that larger story. My topic is the St. Andrews Seven. St. Andrews is the historic university in Scotland on the east coast of Scotland. The St. Andrews Seven, so-called, was made up of one theologian and professor, Thomas Chalmers, and he's the one on he's that one right there, second from the right, Thomas Chalmers, and the 6 students that he inspired to give themselves over to the work of world mission, particularly in the land of India. So these 6 were all focused on India. And that, in some respect, was natural because the British were occupying India. There were natural pathways to go there, despite the opposition of the East India Company. There was still natural set of connections. So Thomas Chalmers was the catalyst of all this. He was the spark. He was the one who got everything going. He never went to India. His ministry was entirely in Scotland, but he was focused, very intently focused on the task of world mission. And the men that he influenced were Alexander Duff, who's probably the most famous of the 6 students that Chalmers had. Alexander Duff. The others were John Urquhart, John Adam, Robert Nesbitt, William Sinclair Mackay, and David Ewart. Those were the 6. So let's start with Chalmers. You might already be familiar with that name because we named our own Chalmers Hall after him downtown. Chalmers Hall is named after Thomas Chalmers. He was born in 1780 and he lived until 1847. 1780 to 1847. He was a great churchman and he was a leader in the Church of Scotland. And he was also subsequently a leader in the breakaway Free Church of Scotland. And the issue behind that division was an issue called intrusionism. Intrusionism, the idea that a minister could be intruded upon a congregation without that congregation's consent, which the Free Church faction opposed. So the church, presbytery, or whatever the authorities would be, they could just assign Murphy, well, not Murphy, that's Irish. They could just assign someone to go to this congregation, and if that congregation didn't like it, then they just had to deal with it. So the Free Church faction opposed that. There was a division in the Church of Scotland, and the Free Church of Scotland was born. Chalmers was a leader in both the Church of Scotland and in the Free Church afterwards. Now, Chalmers was a minister. Let me just give you an overview. Chalmers was a minister. He was a professor of theology at St. Andrews, an educational reformer. He did an enormous amount of work among the poor in Glasgow. He was a mathematician. He was an astronomer, and he was a political economist. He was one of those guys. So he was the counterpart, I think, of Abraham Kuyper in the Netherlands is the same sort of character. Kuyper was a journalist and a minister and founder of the Free University in Amsterdam and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, a tornado in boots. And Chalmers was very much the same kind of omnicompetent character. Chalmers was more enthusiastic about the contributions of Thomas Malthus than he ought to have been, but we're going to look over that. We forgive it. He was a great speaker, and he was a spellbinding preacher, speaker, and he was a best-selling author, including a book on astronomy. So he was a man of great energy and passion, and that energy was genuinely contagious. One bishop applied to him a phrase from Dante, quote, "The holy wrestler, gentle to his own and to his enemies terrible." Gentle to his own and to his enemies terrible. His conversion, Thomas Chalmers' conversion, was really curious in that it happened after he was educated, ordained, and serving as a parish minister in the Church of Scotland. What happened was the minister got converted, it's an upsetting sort of thing. He was obviously a man of talents. I think he went to St. Andrews as a student when he was 11. That was not unheard of in those days, but it was still remarkable. He went there when he was 11. He was a man of obvious talents. He was a brain, but he had no spiritual life. While serving there as a parish minister, he was troubled concerning his own spiritual condition, and this worry sprang from a few unexpected deaths in his close family. I think a brother and a sister, and then his uncle, all dying in a rapid series. And then he got seriously ill, which really shook him up, and he was made aware of the fact that he was in no way prepared. And so he became aware of his spiritual need, and shortly after his 30th birthday, so he's already in his 30s, he came across William Wilberforce's book, A Practical View of Christianity. Now, William Wilberforce, his name has come up a few times. He was a parliamentarian in the English Parliament. He was the instrumental cause for the abolition of the slave trade. He was a great political reformer, and Wilberforce was part of what was called the Clapham sect. The Clapham sect was a group of evangelical social activists, and they were interested, as you heard last night, they were interested in things like getting missionaries into India and eliminating the slave trade and so on. The Clapham sect, William Wilberforce was a politician, and the politician wrote a book that converted the minister. Okay? We need more of that. So he came across this book, he read it, and in reading the book, he encountered the gospel of Christ in stark relief for the first time, and he was converted. So he was converted reading Wilberforce. And he's in his 30s, in the ministry already. Later on, he was to write, there's a great phrase that Chalmers coined on conversion as the expulsive power of a new affection. The expulsive power of a new affection. So there's a transplanted heart. Your old affections are displaced by a new affection. And this was certainly the case in his case, and Chalmers became an evangelical dynamo. So he had a late start, but when he exploded, he took off. Chalmers accepted the chair of moral philosophy at the University of St. Andrews in 1823, and that's where our particular story starts. That's where our particular story picks up. He'd been ministering in a small parish church, and then later he was doing work in Glasgow, and he became, in that phase of his life, he became a very celebrated preacher in Scotland. And when he finally went to be with the Lord, his funeral was a national event. He was a very great statesman without being a statesman, without being in politics. He was a very great figure in Scotland. So in 1823, he came to the University of St. Andrews. He came to St. Andrews as Scotland's most celebrated preacher, and he promptly became a celebrated lecturer. Okay, so he brought the same talents for spellbinding people and getting them all worked up. He brought that into the classroom. And when Chalmers taught, he did not parcel out the truth in dribs and drabs. Right? Chalmers was what you might call a big thinker. He was a big thinker. He was a big vision speaker, and he sought to impart the grand design. Paul speaks in Acts about the whole counsel of God. Chalmers is the same, the whole counsel of God, the kingdom of God. He's the kind of person who would say, let's not be talking about Christian nationalism. We need to be talking about Christian intergalacticalism. So he's interested in the grand design. So Francis Schaeffer noted Christians tend to think in bits and pieces instead of thinking in wholes. Instead of thinking of integrated wholes, we think in bits and pieces, and Chalmers was the opposite of that. As Chalmers himself once put it, regardless of how large, your vision is too small. Regardless how large, your vision is too small. Chalmers made an immediate conquest of his students, including the men we are considering. The first year at St. Andrews, he was teaching Nesbitt, Duff, McKay, and Urquhart, 4 of them, and the next year was Urquhart and Adam. So 4 the first year and 2 the second year, and this formed the St. Andrews 7. The students who attended Chalmers' lectures were set on fire with a passion for missionary work. Right, so he's got the chair of moral philosophy at St. Andrews, and he sets his students on fire with his passion for mission work. And the thing that has to be noted about these men is that they were top flight students. They were brilliant in their work. It was not the case that they were simply punching the clock when it came to their studies, and then as pious types opted to have their off time devoted to the support of missionary activities instead of drinking parties. That's not what this was, no. In this, they were like the Puritans of 2 centuries prior. These guys were brains with feet. It was scholarship on fire, and they were not abstract theoreticians, but they used their minds, which were very cultivated, fine, high-level minds. They used their minds to setting them to the very practical task that was in front of them. And that task, they knew that it was necessary to do. And well, I'll put it this way: they knew it was necessary to do what they were talking about, and what they were talking about was missions. So missions were front and center. And if it doesn't result in application, what good is it? If it doesn't result in activity, in doing, what good is it? And this is the pattern of the book of Ephesians. It's doctrine for 3 chapters, and then imperatives for 3 chapters. This is the truth, this is the truth, this is the truth. There's nothing to do in Ephesians 1 through 3. But then, therefore, husbands, love your wives. Children, obey your parents. Put on the full armor of God. There's a number of things to do. And this, incidentally, is why modern preaching, even good modern preaching, is stuck in Ephesians 1 through 3. It's all indicatives. It's all truth. It's all gospel and no gospel applied, no gospel enacted, no gospel done. So gospel, certainly, and because if you go straight to the second half of Ephesians first, if you go there first, then it's going to degenerate into moralism. You're just going to go around doing good until eventually your do-goodery is going to turn into, as it has in the main lines, do-battery. So, they were men who were intellectually astute, very bright, and Chalmers set them on fire. Now, I want to, let me just make a parenthetical comment that this ties in with some of what we heard last night, and it's something that I want to contextualize. One of the great obstacles that these missionaries had to overcome, and perhaps the greatest obstacle they had to overcome, was the love and affection of their families, who didn't want them to go. Okay, they were They came from solid families. They came from middle-class families. They came from families that loved them and were not entranced with the idea of them heading over to India. We have to remember that the globe was a lot smaller today than it was back then. Now, while it was possible to go back and forth between India and England, it took months to do. Alexander Duff did that a few times. But generally, when you went to India, you went to India, and then maybe later, when you retired, you came back. So it was a far bigger deal than what it is today, which is a 24-hour plane trek, maybe a little more. Leaving your family for India was quite possibly leaving them for good, and sometimes mother didn't adapt well to the idea. So, now there are some aspects in this attitude that these missionaries had toward family that we find to be calloused. And this can particularly be seen in the English attitude toward their own children and the practice of putting them up in boarding schools, which became a standard practice on the mission field down to the present day, where you go to the field, you have a family, and your kids are shipped off months at a time to a boarding school, which I would say, no bueno, no. At the same time, just so that you don't think that these people were just hard-hearted, because they weren't hard-hearted, they had a very affectionate connection with their families. But we have to remember that there are verses. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Matthew 10:37 goes both directions, father or mother and son or daughter. And you say, yeah, but are we contextualizing it in exactly the right ways? I don't think so. But we have to understand that Jesus says that we are to love him more than anyone, more than father or mother, more than son or daughter. And these people were seeking to put that into practice. And it wasn't that they didn't feel what they were doing. They felt what they were doing, but they thought it was the right situation. I don't believe that all their applications were correct. And this is because there's a difference between deny Christ or we'll shoot your mom, and then refusing to deny Christ. That's one thing. Or I'm going to voluntarily sign up with this missionary agency and go do this thing, where it's not being thrust upon you. It's not clearly the providence of God. Nevertheless, their attitude was admirable in many ways. Nesbitt provides us with an example. His last visit to his family before heading to India had to be extended for a few months because of ill health. He went home to say goodbye, and he got sick, and so he had to wait for a few months, and his parents took full advantage of the opportunity to work him over. Quote, this is from a book, the St. Andrew's 7. On the one hand, his attachment to his, quote, good, sweet, tender-hearted, kind, and prudent mother, as he described her in his diary, was deep. He loved his mom, and she certainly loved him. Yet he could not help feeling the less of her because her unrelenting opposition betrayed a lower level of faith than she professed. Okay, so she was just putting the screws on. I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you're doing this. So that was the tension. In other words, one great obstacle to the work of the foreign field was found in the domestic realm. Nevertheless, they pushed through, and the impact that these men were to have on the mission field, that was India, was enormous. The one corrective that I would want to offer them if I had the opportunity, the one corrective I'd want to offer them in this realm is not to be critical of their dedication, but rather that they were not covenantal enough in their thinking. Okay, I think it's a doctrinal issue. I think it was a matter of paradigms and assumptions and doctrinal suppositions. I don't think they were covenantal enough in their thinking. Family and ministry are not two separate departments of your life to be set at odds with each other as though they were rivals. Provided a man is called to the work, a family man's ministry begins with his family and works outward from there. It works out to the field through his family, because he has to always remember, if he has a family, They are an essential part of his ongoing qualifications to continue to minister out there. You can't neglect family for the sake of ministry without, in the long run, disqualifying yourself from the ministry. You can't say, well, the ministry is more important, so I'm going to give myself to the ministry for 3 years until the disarray at home disqualifies me. And that doesn't make any sense. So if the conditions of the foreign mission field are so primitive as to preclude having a family where it just wouldn't be prudent or right to have a family under those conditions, then perhaps it would be time to take a page from the Apostle Paul and the Jesuits. There's a place for men with the gift of celibacy, and this would seem to me to be the sort of place for it. Nevertheless, I think although we're dealing with what I would call some misplaced priorities in some of this, we are also looking at heroics. These were not hard-hearted men. They were compassionate Christian men, and it shows you the power of paradigms and how a cockeyed paradigm can sometimes work you over. And I'm speaking here as someone who actually grew up around this mentality, as my own Canadian mother was a missionary in post-war Japan with an all-women missionary agency. Now, who thought that was a good idea? Well, my mom apparently. But there was a mission agency. They would just send single women to the mission field, and my mom was one of them, and she was there laboring in Japan. And when she finally agreed to marry a persistent American naval officer, and let us say very persistent American naval officer, because she told him to get lost a number of times. She said, get lost, the mission, get lost, the ministry, get lost, and he just didn't. So when he didn't get lost and he kept coming around, she had to overcome a significant amount of pressure from fellow missionaries to not abandon the post. All right. In other words, we're here doing this thing, we're doing this deal. How dare you leave your post? Well, now you might say, are there no circumstances where a man could marry a woman in the foreign mission field and thrive? I think there are circumstances where that could happen. But you'd want to be very confident. Like when you got there to this primitive village, you found a woman there who'd been laboring there 15 years ahead of you, and she thanked you for showing up, and you already knew she could handle it because she went there by herself, because she had signed up with this all-women missionary agency. As you were reminded last night, God draws straight with crooked lines. So back to the impact on India. There must have been something in the air in that century, 19th century. Under the inspiration of Chalmers, these students formed the St. Andrews University Missionary Association in 1824. So they formed a student group to evangelize the world. Okay? But they did this while unaware that the same kind of thing was happening all over the evangelical world. It was happening in America. It was happening in South and England. Students were getting worked up. And this was the kind of setting where the students did not think they needed to wait 20 years after graduation to have an impact, or quote unquote, have an impact. They thought that students needed to change the world while they were still students. And it was changing the world was one of their extracurricular activities. Now, out of these 6, the most brilliant of these students was Urquhart. They were all top drawer, but John Urquhart was the most brilliant of them, who set them all on fire with an address that he gave to their society. So he gave a talk to the student association about missions that just set them all on fire. Chalmers set them all on fire initially, and then Urquhart just went one better. Urquhart himself struggled through to the personal decision that he would dedicate himself to the mission field with India in view. That resolve, and this is God knows what he's doing, and we wouldn't have done it that way, and what was God doing? This resolve was interrupted by the providential hand of God in that Urquhart died of what his doctor thought was a liver ailment in 1827. Okay, so Urquhart dies. He was the most talented, he was the most ambitious, he was top of the form, and it was sort of like Carrie's warehouse burning down. God, what are you doing? What are you doing? Well, Urquhart was a massive inspiration to the others. And this is the thing, he was 18 years old when he died. So in 1827, he was 18 years old when he died. But his output up to that point had been prodigious, and his impact on his friends was monumental. They kept hearkening back to Urquhart. It was suggested among his acquaintances that someone in that circle memorialize Urquhart's work. And the task fell to one William Orme, who produced a 2-volume biography of an 18-year-old. I think back, if someone was assigned, here's that guy, Wilson, write a 2-volume biography of his accomplishments up to the age of 18. Well, Urquhart, they were talking about papers and research and letters, and it was not fluff. It was a serious 2-volume biography of an 18-year-old. But this left 5 men. John Adams sailed for Calcutta in 1828, and then after 5 months of intense study, so he landed, 5 months of intense study, he attempted his first sermon in Bengali. Okay, I'm going to throw myself into the language, and then after 5 months, I'm going to preach. He was a very intense man, and he died in 1831, just a few years later, perhaps of sunstroke. Someone, perhaps Kipling, said that only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun, and this apparently included Scotsmen. But Adam had been the same way about the snow back in Scotland. So he was just a rugged person. He would just go, regardless of weather, he would just go and preach, and go and teach. This left 4. Alexander Duff had joined Adam in 1830, and Alexander Duff arrived in India having survived 2 shipwrecks on the way there. In other words, it wasn't like we think of global travel as, it's a rough day or 2, but this was months and 2 shipwrecks. Well, Urquhart was the most influential of the 6 men upstream. Duff was the most influential of the 5 who actually made it to India. He founded a school in the heart of Calcutta, Scottish Church College. He founded a school, and his marching orders when he was sent out was to basically start a school anywhere but Calcutta. But he decided Calcutta needed to be the place. And he made the interesting decision to teach in English instead of Bengali. His strategic vision was to aim for the conversion of high caste Hindus, in the assumption that this would have a trickle-down effect, which it in fact did. Duff also had a role in founding the University of Calcutta. David Urquhart gave himself to the task of teaching in that school. So the men who remained, all but Nisbet, were heavily involved in education, higher education. That was the strategy. It wasn't that they weren't against street preaching or planting churches, but their goal was educational reform, establish institutions of higher learning. So David Urquhart gave himself to the task of teaching in that school, which was his post until he was taken by cholera in 1860. So he was there some decades teaching, and he was taken to be with God in 1860. And then Mackay was a very fine scholar, serving as the superintendent of Duff's school during Duff's various trips back to England. So Duff was a connector, a networker, planner. He would go back to England to maintain connections. Now, Mackay's health was not robust, and he came close to dying numerous times. His sentiment about these brushes with death was summed up by him in this way, quote, "My chief regret was that I had done so little for Christ and given so much of my time to the world." So he'd been in India for decades, giving his time to the mission, and he was still thinking, I need to have done more. His health finally was in fragments, shattered, and so he retired to Scotland in 1862, dying a few years later in 1865. Robert Nesbitt, remember, he's the one whose mom and dad were really laid on him. Robert Nesbitt gave himself to mission work in Bombay, modern Mumbai. His struggle with his mother was helpful to him when dealing with family opposition to converts coming out of Hinduism. For example, Hindu mothers threatening suicide or striking themselves in the head with bricks. If you become a Christian, this is what I'm going to do. So there your mom is hitting herself with a brick, and don't you dare get baptized. But Nesbitt said, no, following Christ is what matters. That's what matters. And then Duff labored in India until 1864. He finally left India for good in 64, and he became the professor of missions at New College in Edinburgh. He died in 1878. So they had, and the works, the institutions, the things that they did continue to this day. However, the institutions founded and shaped by these men are still going, but they are now part of the establishment. They're just part of you go there and you don't see anything fresh and new. You see something that's been there for a long time. And so perhaps the question might be raised, what good was all that effort? All this sacrifice, what good was it? They founded these institutions, and then everything grows up and sort of takes them in stride and assimilates them. And this is what I want to conclude on, an exhortation for us thinking about church planting and mission work with a long view. I want us to go back to what Chalmers said, regardless of how large, your vision is too small. I want to leave you with some of this. I'm reminded of the comment by Christopher Dawson, which was that the Christian faith lives in the light of eternity and can afford to be patient. The Christian church lives in the light of eternity. For Christians, history is driven by eternity, not the other way around. History is not what shapes eternity. Eternity, God's eternal decree, God's sovereign control of all things, is what shapes human history. And God knows what he's doing. So, part of that, we can afford to be patient. Part of that patience means that we must learn how to layer our metaphors. We have to learn how to layer our metaphors. The kingdom of God does advance inexorably, but there are different ways of thinking about it. There's the wheat field, but with all the tares. Matthew 13:25. When we say, what good is it to plant all these institutions that are now part of the establishment? Well, there's a wheat field. What good is planting a wheat field if there are going to be tares? What good is it planting wheat if there's going to be weeds? There are 3 measures of flour, which incidentally is enough to feed a regiment, but with the yeast thrown in. Luke 13:21, that's another metaphor. And it's quite interesting. When Jesus says the kingdom of God is like 3 measures of flour. Why 3 measures of flour? Why that? Well, that's how much Sarah made when Abraham was feeding the angels. So she takes 3 measures of flour, and again, enough to feed a regiment. And Jesus, I think, is hearkening back to Abraham and Sarah. 3 measures of flour, you throw yeast into the flour, and you don't wait 30 seconds to see what it does. That's not how yeast works. Yeast is when you're putting yeast in the flour, you are playing the long game. There is the metaphor of a mustard seed producing a huge plant, which is Mark 4:31. Also gradualism. But for our purposes here, the pattern or the metaphor that I'd like you to think about is the pattern of wineskins. The pattern of wineskins. Jesus says in Mark 2:22, and no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine doth burst the bottles, and the wine is spilled, and the bottles will be marred. But new wine must be put into new bottles. New wine has to go into new bottles. Now, I've been privileged, and it really is a great privilege to be involved at the ground floor of a number of institutions. But I know that every institution that I've been part of starting is operating in a fallen world. It's operating in a world in which 300 years from now, this institution that I founded might be bad. Or it might be inept, it might be inert, it might be just ossified conservatism, it might be any number of, but whatever it is, it's going to be an old wineskin. Whatever it is, it's going to be an old wineskin. And I don't think that there's anything you can do to keep a new wineskin from turning into an old wineskin. There's nothing you can do. Now, not all new wineskins are equal, and not all old wineskins are equal, but this appears to be part of God's pattern. And when we look at the history of redemption in the pages of Scripture, it follows this pattern very much. And then if we look at post-apostolic church history, it's the same pattern. It's the same pattern over and over and over. God stirs up his people, and they do something wonderful, and they plant an institution, and then inertia sets in. Right? And what is that inertia? Well, that's a new wineskin turning into an old wineskin. But we have the temptation of thinking that just because old wineskins come from new wineskins, we think that that this necessarily means that God is going to run out of new wine. It is never the case that God is going to run out of new wine. Never the case. The Lord teaches us not to be surprised at the aging of wineskins. And I believe that we are also to be reminded that he is the Lord of the new wine. God is the Lord of history. God is the Lord of history. And he is the one who directs the process of evangelization and missional fermentation. Because that's what this is, fermentation. It's fermentation. He is the one who brings the new wine, which he does with regularity. It's one of his central methods. One of the things he does is he brings new wine into old wineskins, and they burst, and there's wine all over the floor. Other times, there is some sort of great shakeup, institutional shakeup, and the old wineskin manages to adapt and become something of a new wineskin. Other times, there's a parallel institution set up that carries on in the tradition of the old wineskin, and they're doing, there are certain inspiring verses inscribed on the old wineskin that nobody's doing anymore. And then they publish books about the old days. And then some young 25-year-old gets a hold of those books, reads them, and says, hey, this is a great idea. I learned all these tricks from the old wineskin, and the old wineskin kicks them out because he learned all these. If you know what some of you have been there. I've certainly been there. I've been ostracized for believing things that I learned from the people who are doing the ostracizing. Well, look at this. Who published this book? I just said, but never mind. And so then they take the inheritance, they take the good stuff, and then all of a sudden there's a new wineskin, new wine, and the pattern starts over. So just for purposes of comparison, let's take the death of Alexander Duff in the year 1878. That's when Alexander Duff died. This was exactly, follow me closely here, this was exactly 1 century before 1978, when Nancy and I had been married for 3 years already. It wasn't that long prior, 100 years. Today, there are people in Moscow here who are 100 years old. They were born in 1924. Okay? And the day they were born, there was someone who was 100 years old in their town who was born in 1824, which is this period. Right? This is two lifetimes, end to end, and you're right back into this period. It wasn't that long ago. Now, in God's scheme of things, 1 century is nothing. 1 century is nothing. Declaring Duff's strategy a poor one, because one wineskin got old, is to complain about how God made the world. Was Paul's strategy of planting churches all over the Mediterranean a poor one? Because a century after he died, say 165 AD, the church in Ephesus was not doing well. And we tend to think of 165, 265, 365, that all runs together, right? Who lived first, Origen or Athanasius? Well, Origen was first, but how many people know that it's all blurry, right? Well, what about 5 centuries? So this is the exhortation. Take the long view. Take the long view. The successful evangelization of the world is not going to come out of a vending machine. It's not like we do this and then we get the evangelized world. It's not going to be something that we are going to get from a convenience store. Now, you heard last night that the post-mill view was a major driver in this explosion of world missions, which it was. But the post-mill view should not be an example of over-realized eschatology. Over-realized eschatology is where you think, I've learned this in the Bible, and it's all going to come to pass in the next 3 years. Right. It's all going to happen right now. The post-mill view does not require us to believe that the kingdom of God takes off like a space shuttle. It is not the case that we plant this work, and then every day in every way we're going to be higher in altitude, and it's just going to take off like a space shuttle. No, the post-mill conviction, the post-mill approach, is more like crawling on hands and knees from western Nebraska to the Continental Divide. It's a long time with lots of ups and downs. That's what this is. Now, and you say, oh, you mean, look at church history. And if you look at church history in 5-year increments, you're going to be discouraged a lot. If you look at your own life in 5-year increments, you're going to be discouraged a lot. But look at church history in 500-year increments. Where was the gospel when Jesus on the Mount of Olives said to his disciples, all right, the plan is to conquer the world. On 3. The disciples are looking around saying, we have no armies, we have no navies. We have, what do we have? But there's one thing they didn't have at that point, and that was the Spirit. He told them to go back to Jerusalem and wait for the Spirit. But when the Spirit was poured out, what did they have in terms of human resources? What did they have? They had words and water and bread and wine. That's what they had. Now, go, conquer the world. Now, when you look at the world 50 years after that moment when Jesus ascended in heaven, 50 years after, that's like looking at the yeast in the loaf 5 minutes after you put it in there. But look at the world 500 years after. Now the empire's Christian, the emperor is a professing Christian. That's 500 years. And then go another 500 years, 1,000, 1,500, year 2000. There's 4 500-year increments. Is there any transformation at all? No, Alexander Duff and his friends put a great deal of yeast into the Indian loaf, and it's still there. It's still working. Don't say, oh, the yeast just works for 5 years and then stops. That's not how it goes. So always remember that the meaning of history, including the history of missions, is to be grounded in eternity. Human history is not the absolute. To think that way is to think like a secularist. The secularist is contained within this system. There is a ceiling above him, and there's nothing outside. He has no transcendent connection. He has no connection to eternity. And we shouldn't think like they do. We have a connection to eternity. We know the eternal one. He has decreed that it go exactly this way. He's the one who determined that Carrie's warehouse should burn down. He's the one who determined that Urquhart should die when he's 18 years old. And we say, oh no, everything is ruined. No, never. It's not ruined. Step back, look at it, step back, zoom out, look at it that way. The history of mission, like all human history, has to be grounded in eternity. It's not the other way around. It's not the other way around. And so we should therefore be encouraged. Your labor in the Lord, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 15:58, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Your labor in the Lord is not in vain. One missionary labors for decades and not one conversion. Another missionary labors for 3 weeks and people start coming to the Lord, and we say, well, what's the use of doing this then? Well, remember what we heard last night about the Moravians and the Moravians who left India. Okay, this is not going to be any good, but then it was. So God causes some people to come right away. God controls it all. And God is good all the time. God is omniscient, omnipresent, all-encompassing all the time. He's the one who gave us these orders. And so whatever it is we do, whether we see immediate fruit or not, your labor in the Lord is not in vain.